Okay, welcome back. Good to see you. If you're new here, my name's Joel. I'm one of the leaders in the church here. We have teaching from the Bible every week here at Church of Christ the King, and we are going through the book of Matthew, or at least we're going through one chapter of the book of Matthew. It's a long book. We're just doing one of the chapters at the moment, chapter 16. This chapter is a good chapter to start the year off with because it's Jesus gathering these 12 apostles or disciples, as we tend to call them in these stories, and saying to them, first of all, what is the word out there regarding who I am? He's saying to them, look, I want to know what the people out there in the street are saying about me. And they didn't have social media. He couldn't just do a kind of quick hashtag thing and just get some comments back on Twitter. He had to actually open his mouth, strange though it might sound, and the comments come back. And then he says to them, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? Now, this you need to understand isn't because Jesus was terribly insecure and wanted to just, what do you think of me? Do you like me? Does anybody like me? That wasn't really his instinct. If you read the stories of Jesus, you notice he didn't seem to care that much about whether people liked him. But he did want to know very much if these disciples, these close 12, had understood who he was. That bothered him. That was important to him. Do these guys get it yet? Do they know who I am? And of course, this is a massive question because as soon as Jesus is looking at you in the eye and saying, who do you think I am? It stops becoming an academic exercise. It stops becoming just hypothetical or, just a theory. Well, some people say this and some people say that, and I like to think of you as a little bit like this and a little bit like that. If you go into the streets of the city today, you go into your workplace, go into your neighborhood, maybe go back to your flat or your house and ask friends, relatives, neighbors, who do you think Jesus is? You could perhaps get some kind of a conversation going. It might be quite stimulating, it might be quite interesting, it might be quite intellectual. When you say to people, look them in the eye, say, what about you? No, don't just say what others think. What do you think? Who do you think he is? Well, you may find the temperature changes slightly. You may find people become slightly less comfortable. And there are reasons for that. The primary reason being the claims Jesus made. Jesus claimed to be more than just any other man or any other great religious teacher even. Jesus claimed to be so important that when we're dealing with him, we're not even just dealing with a man. And so our response to him is about as important a thing as there could be. Our response to him is the most fundamental question about who we are and what we believe. Who do you say Jesus is? Who do you think Jesus is? We can't answer that question without having a dog in the fight, so to speak. It's going to raise the stakes. It raises the game. And to say, yeah, I think that Jesus is God in any time in history, especially, I suppose, for these 12 to say, I think Jesus is the Messiah, as one of them is about to say in the story we'll read in a moment. That's a little bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. That's a huge thing to say. It's not academic anymore. I am pointing the gun at myself when I say this because this is controversial. This is a test. This is challenging. There's a lot more at stake than just theory. You are deciding about your life, about whether you're going to line up with him and let him be master as he claims he should be or not. So let's just read this story together, and I'm going to read from chapter 16, verses 13 to 18. It goes like this. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And just a bit of background on that if you're new to the Bible. Those are basically characters from the Old Testament. They're called prophets. They're people who spoke for God in previous generations. John the Baptist is the exception. He was more recent. He was actually Jesus' cousin, but he was also a prophet, and he'd spoken for God previously, but he'd already been killed. He'd had his head chopped off by the king, King Herod. So they're saying, John the Baptist, in saying that, they're saying, you're like, he's come back to haunt us. He's come back to get us back. Verse 15, he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. That just means son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay, so when it comes to understanding who Jesus is, these guys definitely have had some challenges. And in some respects, the challenges are just the same for you and me. 20 centuries later, we've got the same kinds of difficulties, the same kinds of real problems to overcome in understanding who he is. I'm going to just pick out three key problems, the main problems that we will face if we want to truly understand Jesus from the outset. The first one of these problems is the problem of suspicion. The problem of suspicion. And what I mean by this is probably more an issue of our time than it would have been for these gentlemen at this stage in history. A tendency to assume the worst of things that are written down so long ago. Especially perhaps things that are written down in the Bible, in what we might call sacred or religious books. There's a tendency for us to assume that these things ought not to be taken as history. These ought not to be taken as verifiable. They're very shoddy documents. They're subject to all kinds of distortion and change. It's basically Chinese whispers. That's what's happened. That's why we have a Bible, because something happened. Somebody who may have been called Jesus came along, told some stories, was quite good at telling stories, and did quite well at certain public events, and people really liked him. Then that kind of grew to a massive mania, a big following, and then that grew and that multiplied. And as the story grew, so it changed, and within a few generations, through this process of Chinese whispers, you end up with basically a completely different Jesus than the real one. And so we need to treat this whole record here with a lot of suspicion, because it cannot be trusted as actual history. And not only do we think about this, have this suspicious attitude out of a sense of just general doubt about the reliability of documents that seem so distant from the past, but we might also be suspicious about motives. We might think additionally that, well, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, let's say, the institutional churches have a lot to lose. So what happened was they distorted the teaching of Jesus in a way that would give them more control. They made Jesus out to be more than he really was, so that they would be able to influence the rabble, influence the masses by threatening them with well, Jesus, the eternal God, is on our side, and we are the Roman Catholic Church. Now, what I'm describing to you, this way of thinking, is kind of familiar to some of us if you've come across the Dan Brown novels or movies and some of the various theories that go around out there, not just through those books and films, but sometimes documentaries, sometimes even quite respected academics who are skeptical about Christianity will come out with this kind of theory saying, well, how can we be sure that Jesus ever really existed? I just need to say at the outset, because I want to push this first problem aside fairly quickly and not spend too much time on it. We don't really need to worry in reality about whether or not the gospel books, the books of the Bible describing Jesus, should be trusted as history or not. The people that say that the gospels are all sort of Chinese whispers or made up myths are not really historians. The people that do the actual work of threshing out whether or not the Gospels can be understood and trusting how to understand them, the experts in history. I'm not talking about believers, I'm talking about people who are not believers and people who are believers. Put that category aside, the main point being that they are experts at studying, at scholarship of the New Testament, this stuff I've been reading to you and you can read in your own time. They would say this is basically very good, reliable history. I mean, for one reason, for example, it was actually written way too early for it to be Chinese whispers. For it to have been distorted that much, for the message of Jesus to have been changed from a nice, well-meaning Galilean peasant into the Son of God who did miracles and rose from the dead, you would need, I think, generations or at least a very long process of time for this distortion to happen, for the wrong end of the stick to be got so often that it would get changed so much. But that's not what we find here. What we find in books like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, books that were written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. In fact, at least in a couple of cases, they probably were written by eyewitnesses. You might even notice that one of the big New Testament scholars of our time, a man called Richard Borkham, has written a compelling book where he's really demonstrated in a way that's closed a lot of mouths that one of the reasons, for example, that in Mark's gospel, lots of people who are obscure characters, who seem to be like bit part players in the story, get named a lot of the times, is because they're still around when Mark wrote the gospel. He's saying that's a way, as a style in that ancient time of how people would preserve stories in communities by naming the people that were there who you can go and ask. And so Mark's gospel, just as one example, is showing that really the gospel records are pretty good history. They're not just saying, I heard that such a thing happened. They're saying, this is what happened, we saw it, and here are a few eyewitnesses as well who you can go and verify it with. One of the most famous examples of this is in 1 Corinthians 15, which most scholars would agree was only written at the latest about 20 years after the events of Jesus' death and resurrection, according to what the Bible teaches. This is what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised from the third day, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. What's the point? Why did I read that long thing to you? The point is that Paul, who's writing this part of the Bible, he's saying, it's not just me that's saying this. There are 500 witnesses. I'm naming a few of them. You can talk to all of them. This is from a letter that was written publicly. It was a public letter. And so Paul is nailing his reputation to the mast in a massive way by saying, I know of hundreds of witnesses, hundreds. I can name them to you who will agree with me about the historicity of what I'm saying. Where am I going with this? I'm saying we needn't come to this book and think of it as just a bunch of legends and fairy tales. When it's describing the life, the times, the experiences, the teachings, the deeds of Jesus' life, what we're dealing with here is something pretty practically described. We can take it quite seriously. It's also very honest, if you think about it. If I was making up the story of Jesus, I mean, for example, if I was one of these disciples, I was thinking, let's make up a religion that will give us power and really set us up for life. Well, they did a really bad job of that, didn't they? I mean, most of them got seriously beaten up, and most of them, in fact, got martyred for it. And if they wanted the stories of Jesus' life to put them in a good light, they also did that very badly. If you notice the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, all the leaders, all the disciples look like fools. They look like idiots or cowards quite a lot of the time. So they're clearly, I mean, you know, it's a strange thing. They're not sort of presenting themselves in a very good light if this is basically fabricated stuff. It's a very honest account, and it suggests to us that we should take this stuff seriously. If I were you, and I was starting to look into Christianity because a friend of mine invited me, or I came to one of the Christmas services, and I came back after Christmas, started the new year thinking, I'd like to investigate, I'd like to go to church and look into it. Listen, if I were you, there's no way I would take one more step if I was not convinced that there was a certain level of history to it. If it didn't actually add up, if these things didn't actually happen at all, please don't worry. Just go home and do something else. There's other things to do with your life. The test must be, does this measure up? Did it actually happen? Is there any credibility to it? And that's a question worth asking. I'm only trying to push out a few little answers in the time I have before I move on. If you want to investigate that further, you must, you should, because Christianity appeals to history. It deserves historical investigation. It deserves that careful analysis. Did these things really happen? I believe with all my heart they did. Not just because I'm an optimist, but because I've become persuaded these things are reliable. They make a lot more sense than to believe otherwise. Let's move on to the second problem we might have with understanding who Jesus really is. The second problem is what I would call a problem of obscurity. The problem of obscurity. What I mean by this is, okay, we might accept, he really existed, and the teachings of the Gospels are basically accurate in describing what he did and what he said. But how does that apply to my life now? How does the stuff Jesus said actually make any difference to me in the here and now, especially given the fact that he really seemed to be particularly concerned with issues, concerns, problems in his own time and space? I mean, you look at it, even in verse 16 here, which we read together, when he asks the disciples, who do you say I am? Simon Peter replies, you are the Christ. Now that is a game changer. That's a moment in history where it's like bang, you could almost hear the tumbleweeds going across. It's like, wow, this is a serious moment. But why? Why should it be? If you live in 21st century Brighton, the fact that somebody 20 centuries ago called someone else the Christ doesn't necessarily change your life very much. What is the Christ? Why should I care who or what the Christ is? And the issue that we have to face is that we can't just co-opt Jesus. We can't just nick him from his own time and space, his culture, his world, his context, into ours and make it work. Like transfer him, just say, okay, Jesus, you were important in your time. We think you're kind of important because there's something we quite like about you. Let's just pick Jesus up and make him a kind of badge for our time as well. Now, people have tried to do that all through history, especially in recent years. We've got so many different Jesuses. Over recent years, people have come along with what's become called the quest for the historical Jesus. It kind of started in Germany and countries like that in the Western kind of world, Western Europe, about 18th century. The idea being, let's try to investigate who Jesus was from a historical point of view and see what message we can get from him. And people, got very clever and very sort of intellectual about it and got into discussions and formed careful opinion groups and talked way up into the night and wrote big fat books and got lots of letters after their names discussing carefully the historical Jesus. They didn't believe he was the Son of God, but they wanted to say, well, let's just see what we can make him, how can we understand what he was really like and what he was about? The thing is, though, what tended to happen was that every time someone tried to kickstart this quest for the historical Jesus, they ended up with a Jesus who looked suspiciously like the perfect person idealized in their particular culture. So if you lived in 18th century Germany, in one of the kind of universities of that time, Jesus came along as a kind of a very erudite, sophisticated, elegant, German, enlightened intellectual. That's what he was. That's what Jesus really was. If you lived in Victorian Britain, 19th century in London, Jesus was a kind of imperial Britishman, Englishman, basically. And people have tried to, grab him. He fits our agenda. I mean, even more recent history and reality, people are always trying to do this. New Age religious people will try and say Jesus was basically, kind of Shirley MacLaine for the first century. He was a guy who believed in the God within. We are all God. We all have God within us. And Jesus saw that in a way that some enlightened people do. And that's what he was. And then, the 1960s generation, Jesus was, he wore sandals and he had long hair, so he was one of us. He was a kind of a youth revolt person from the 60s. That's what he was. He was basically John Lennon. And through history, this happens. Like, honestly, you just look at it; it just happens again and again and again and again and again and again. And from time to time, people have come along and had the guts and the honesty to say, enough. It doesn't work. You can't do that. He definitely belongs more to his time than that. His passions, the things he's concerned about, are more focused than that. So we can't just say we're 21st century Brightonians. Let's really investigate carefully. What's Jesus about? Who is Jesus? What's he about? Well, we've discovered, amazingly enough, Jesus was a recycling vegetarian who had his own coffee industry and ground his own beans that were carefully sourced and voted for the Green Party. And that's exactly what Jesus was. And we might try that. Maybe all those things might have been true. But trust me, friends, we're going up the wrong tree when we do that. We need to be more honest with the context. What was he really about? What in his own time and space? What was his passion? What was his focus? And the fact is that he gets referred to as the Christ. There's some story that's already going on that he's fitting into. Not our story, not our time yet. His story first, his era, his time, his concerns. Those are the issues that he's responding to. It's interesting as well. When he says to the 12, who do they say that I am? What's the word out there? When you do hashtag Jesus, what are the kind of comments that come up? And the comments are, well, some say that you're John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now, I think to myself, what is it about those three men? Interesting choice. And if you know your Bible a bit, you'll know that these guys have something in common. They're pretty fighting people. They're aggressive people. They're not pleasant sages. They're not relaxed people. They're definitely not peace-loving hippies. That John the Baptist, Jeremiah, Elijah, they were fiery. They were quite often angry, aggressive. They spoke against the system, the structure, the regime of the time, not out of some cool, youthy t-shirt kind of instinct, but out of a genuine sense that God was going to bring an end. God, the mighty God, was going to show up any moment and obliterate by fire his enemies who were running the kind of pretend power of the time. These were the guys, John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, all of those had that message. Their message was, repent, God's going to come and blow you all away. Watch out, God's coming. That was their message. Not everyone in the Bible has that message. But they did, all three of those did. And when they say, what's Jesus like? They all say those three guys. Isn't that interesting? That's fascinating. So Jesus' public image, his brand, if you like, was of a fiery prophet of destruction. That should surprise you, because it's definitely not the image that our culture has of him. We don't think of him like that. The last thing we like to think of Jesus being is judgmental. Of course he's not judgmental. He's the one that said, don't judge lest you be judged. And we know in a strange way, people read those bits and they come away saying, well, that means he's never judged anybody. You read what they're saying. They saw fire in his eyes. They saw him as a mighty judge. He was passionate. There was something he was angry about. There was something he wanted to see changed. There was something he was passionate and fiery and jealous for. Does that surprise you? It should. It should help you to get a glimpse into a piece of his identity that we can be missing if we're a little not careful enough. Jesus seems, if you read his stories, if you read what he's talking about, he seems to be convinced that the whole world is about to be transformed in his lifetime by some massive epoch-making event that will bring an end to evil and bring in the reign, the kingdom of God. That's his main teaching. His main teaching is not be nice to each other and tolerate each other. That's the 21st century Brightonian Jesus. The Jesus of the Bible is not mainly teaching that. It might come up, but that's not his main message. His main message is God is going to do something because he wants to change this wicked, unjust world. He's going to do it in my lifetime. He's going to transform everything. The kingdom of God is about to come. and break out. God's enemies are about to be destroyed. Destroyed, I tell you. Destroyed. You can see the fire in his hair going mental. What? Is that Jesus? Yeah, you bet it is. You read it. So here we are left with a question. Does that make him a failure? A confusing, irrelevant failure from a distant age? We all thought Jesus was, Gandhi and Mandela rolled into one. We all thought he was Mother Teresa, and it turns out he was, one of these crazy wild prophets. And it didn't work. He said it was all going to change. He was going to deal with God's enemies in his lifetime. Didn't happen. World's still in trouble. He died. He got taken away and killed. It's the end. It was a failure. He was a failure. Lots of scholars have come away from it all, studying it all, saying, well, in the end, we've got to confess the fact that he was a failure. He was a good failure, but a failure. But suppose you think of it a bit further on. You think, okay, we understand him better when we look at him honestly. We see that he belonged to his time. He belonged to a story, the Israel story of Israel, the enemies of Israel, all the wicked powers that surround Israel, Rome and so on, all these terrible military forces. There are real enemies out there. There's a real people of God. And it didn't work. Jesus got killed. It all burned. It all finished. It didn't work. He threw himself on history, hoping he'd change it, and he just got broken on the wheel. But supposing he knew something that we didn't know. Supposing he knew the enemy was not the enemy we thought, not the enemy they thought. And as we read on, and we'll read on more in the next couple of weeks, we'll discover that's precisely what seems to have happened. When Jesus turns up saying, oh, the kingdom of God is amongst you, the kingdom of God is amongst you, the kingdom of God is amongst you, surprisingly enough, he doesn't start by saying, and I am the king. Doesn't do that. Doesn't start that way. It takes a few years, it would seem, before he even coaxes it out of his best friends. When some people, inspired, it would seem, by evil spirits, said to him, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God, he told them to be quiet. What's that about? Why didn't Jesus want people to know? Why didn't Jesus shout it from the rooftops? I'm here, I'm the Messiah, I'm God's king. He didn't do that. He seems to have kept it to himself. What's going on here? Surely, a suggestion would be that he knows that if he goes in with that badge, everybody takes it the wrong way. Everybody gets behind him as the next military hero. They see him as a terrorist. They start arming themselves. They say, right, this is what we've been waiting for. Let's kill the Romans. Jesus doesn't want that. Jesus says, listen, guys, first of all, let me huddle just the 12 of you together. We're not even going to meet in Israel for this. I'm going to take you up north. We're going to go for 2 days walk to Caesarea Philippi. I'm going to keep you away. I'm going to sit you down. I'm going to say, who do they say that I am? And then they answer the question. Then he says, now, who do you say that I am? And they say, you're the Christ. And then as you'll see in the next couple of weeks, he starts to tell them what it really means for him to be the Christ. Because their idea of the Christ and his idea of the Christ, the Messiah, the King, is completely different. Because his idea of the enemy is completely different. Their idea of the enemy is anything that makes my life inconvenient and anything that takes down my pride, especially, for example, the Romans. Their idea of what's important to God is me, my pride, my national identity, and anything that's bad is, well, the Romans, the enemies over there. Jesus comes along saying, no, your real enemy isn't actually the Romans particularly. They're not your biggest problem. Your biggest enemy is the one inside here. And when I talk about taking down the enemies of God in my lifetime, when I talk about winning a battle, when I talk about God's kingdom breaking in and bringing transformation, I'm talking about that enemy. And I'm going to do it through myself. And the battle I will fight will not be by inflicting blood, by inflicting scars and wounds, by taking people down physically. The battle I will win by my own wounds, by my own blood. The real battle, the real monster that needs to be taken down is the selfishness, the human pride, the sin, the rejection of God, the desire to replace God with other things. That's the real enemy that must be destroyed. And if it's not destroyed, it doesn't matter what else we do. Any political change, any economic improvement, any social advance, any educational development is just changing the deck chairs on the Titanic. It doesn't make any real difference. The real change must be in the heart of man. The problem is deep, and it's within each and every single one of us. Sinful, selfish, greedy inclinations away from God, choosing to base our God-given lives on other things than God, choosing other gods, in effect, saying to God, the God who chose us, loved us, cares for us, we don't care for you, we don't want you, we don't choose you. And that's been our problem from the beginning. Jesus has come to deal the death blow to that problem, and he did so through his incredible work for us, through his death and his resurrection. And so we can understand when we read this something of Jesus' urgency and his passion. Yes, he is a fiery prophet. Yes, he is angry because there's something great he wants to take down. There's a great and real enemy. You might say, well, has he failed or has he succeeded? The world's still a sick place, still an evil place. Well, we also know from what he said that it hasn't finished, but the main battle has been won. That's what his cross and resurrection was about. It was the main battle, a decisive battle being won. Sometimes in the history of warfare, that happens. One battle changes the whole war. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, it wasn't the end of the Second World War, but anyone who really was watching knew it was the end. It was the end. It was still going to be a long time of excruciating fighting and difficulty and pain and sorrow, but the war was won. The war was won because the decisive victory had taken place. It's just the same with the cross and resurrection. What Jesus did through his death and resurrection is decisive forever and ever. And even if it takes time, literally centuries, for his victory to be thoroughly worked out in creation, that doesn't change the fact he won decisively on that day. And we see some of that happening. We don't hear it reported in the press. When the British media talks about Christianity, as they have done a little bit recently, when the BBC picks up on the church, they're talking about a few bishops having a row about sexual orientation. If they talked about the church as God knows it around the world, they'd have a lot more to say. It'd be a lot more inspiring, be a lot more interesting. You know that hundreds of thousands of people become Christians every week. Hundreds of thousands. You know that the fastest growing religion in the world is not Islam, it's Christianity. You know that in places like Africa and South America, in places over in Asia, Christianity, the growth of the church outstrips the birth rate by a long way. He has a purpose and a plan. So what does this mean? Well, there's one last problem that we have to deal with, and we're no different to these 12 men in this respect. We may be different in history, but we're not different in heart. I want to talk about the problem of blindness. It's there in verse 17. Jesus answers Peter, so Peter's got the right answer. You're the Christ. You're the Son of God. That's who I say you are. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. In other words, Peter, you didn't work this out. You didn't suss this out. It was a gift. It was given you. You understood it because of God's kindness. God opened your eyes to see it. And it's really like that every time someone comes to know Jesus Christ. Maybe that's been your story. I know for hundreds of us here today, that's precisely our story. There was a time when we didn't know who he was. And then there was a day when we just knew. And we could even feel it almost. Some of us, it's like I know someone very close to me who said, as soon as he understood that Jesus actually had risen from the dead, not just as a nursery rhyme, not just as a school assembly, not just as a poster or a stained glass window, he knew it was real. He just found himself sobbing, couldn't stop sobbing. That doesn't mean that's the only way to come to Christ, but it's just a demonstration of how you suddenly are aware he's real. This isn't just a story. He is real. He's real. I wonder if there are people here today who are coming to that realization. Maybe you're watching this and you're coming to that realization. He's real. He's the one that makes sense of history. He's the person that all time has been about. He's the person I was born to know. I've been looking for him all my life and I never really realized. You need to see him. Only God the Father can make him known to you. You need to have him revealed to you. You might say, how can I make that happen? Well, here's the thing. If in your heart there's even the slightest desire for it to happen, that's very encouraging. Because Jesus himself said, we looked at this last week in John chapter 3, here's the verdict. Light has come into the world, but the world hates the light because it prefers the darkness. Prefers the dark because its evil deeds get shown up by the light. Generally, we don't seek God. Generally, we're not looking for Jesus. Barely anyone. If you go, isn't it interesting? You can have a conversation with people about God quite naturally. You can sit in sophisticated radio discussions on Radio 4 or newspaper columns or letters pages having discussions about God or the transcendent or the noumenal. As soon as someone says Jesus, it gets a little bit awkward. Jesus is the controversial issue. People need to be inspired to hunt him down, to truly look for who he really is. If you're here saying, I really want to know him, I tell you, that's good. That says to me that God's already at work in your heart. Because it wouldn't be happening otherwise. You wouldn't be seeking him if God hadn't worked that in your heart. Jesus said so. The world hates the light. If you have chosen to look out for him, something's happened within you. I want to urge you to look out for him all the more. But I want to talk to you, all of you. Seek him, search him out, understand him. Make it your aim this year. Let me just say, it's still January, it's still worth saying, what's your plan on looking into this book this year? Some of you, this last 2 years, you've given your time to reading the Bible through in a whole year. Some of you did that a couple of years ago with us as a whole church. We did that. It's a brilliant exercise. But do it with this attitude. Say, Father, teach me about your Son. Help me to have a humble heart. Help me have a teachable heart. Show me who he is. Show me what he's like. Show me his style. Don't let me read it blindly. Don't let me read it without seeing him. Give me spiritual insight into him, his riches, his beauty, his goodness. Change me on the inside as I discover him in this book. And finally, the last thing that I note is there in verse 18. Jesus says to him, I tell you, you're Peter. On this rock I'll build my church. He's saying this to Simon. Simon's the man who has just confessed, Jesus, you are the Christ. If you know the story of Simon Peter, you'll know what kind of a man he was. You'll know his weaknesses, his failings. You'll know how frequently he was rash, he was foolish, he was full of himself, overconfident, arrogant even. He's the kind of man that a lot of us find very comforting because we can relate to him. We see our failings and our weaknesses in him. I think, gosh, if Jesus would choose a man like him, that means that he's not made a mistake in choosing me, perhaps. Jesus says to him at this point of Peter's life, when Peter says, I see who you are, it's just at that point Jesus turns to him and says, and I see who you are. I find this helpful because I think I live like you do at a time when we're all looking to know who we are ourselves, right? Such a longing for identity, longing for a sense of personhood. What am I? What am I worth? What am I doing in life? Where am I going? Am I my job? Am I my career? Am I my trajectory? If I am, then when I have a dip, I'm nothing. Am I my relationships? Well, what if they go wrong? I'm nothing. Am I my marriage? What if my marriage goes sideways? I'm nothing. Am I my children? What if my children go wrong? Am I my finances? We're looking for identity and we tie it up with things we've achieved, things we've perhaps fallen into, perhaps things we've inherited. We might have a sense of identity that's actually quite secure, thank you very much, but we know that it could be taken from us at any time. we know we need terribly to find what our true identity is. The true thing, friends, is that we never really know who we are unless the person who knows everything tells us. I mean, it's just a fact. It's just a physical fact. It's common sense. You don't even know what the back of your head looks like. You don't even know the sound of your voice. You ever listen back to a tape recording or a recording of your own voice? It's really difficult to, that's not me. That's not me. You don't know yourself that well. You think you do, but you don't. You don't know yourself. We'd all like to, wouldn't we? We don't really get to know ourselves just by trying harder. We can ask around, that's helpful. It's good to have people who tell you the truth, trustworthy friends who you can sort of get facts from, that's good. But what if there was someone who knew everything about you, everything there was to know, knew every thought in your head, knew every hair on your head, and could tell you who you are, give you a sense of identity, sense of purpose, give you a new name even. God's got a habit of giving people new names in this book. Does it all the time. This is what you think you are, I'll tell you who you are. I don't know, maybe you've come in here today, you think, well, I'm basically a thief. I'm basically a disappointment to my parents. I'm basically a failed businessman. I'm basically a divorcee. I'm basically got learning difficulties. I'm basically just seriously impaired in some physical way. That's what I am. I'm basically a failure. I'm basically a sinner. Basically, that's what I am. I'm a failure before men. I'm a failure before God. That's what I am. Maybe you are so sure of that. Maybe you feel like that very strongly. God comes into the world, reveals himself, and when we say to him, I see who you are. You're Jesus, the Christ, the victor, the king, the one who defeats sin, the one who overcomes the power of evil through your death and resurrection. He turns around to you and says, you're mine. You're my child. You're my cherished one. Gives you identity, gives you freedom, gives you hope. You can receive that today, maybe for the first time. We'd love to help you to do that. If you've never come to Christ, we want you to do that.